Are we out of control again in Silicon Valley?
I don't think we're as out of control as we were in the late 90s in terms of valuations and things like that. I do think, there are moments when you hear people talking about conquering death and things like that, and taking that talking about it in a very serious fashion that make you wonder.
Do you smile when you hear some of these biologists talk about conquering death? Do you think they're insane?
Insane, maybe overstating it, but the fact that very serious. I mean, in this case, a person from Pfizer, for instance, was sort of saying, "Well, we're not quite there yet," and I was sort of taken aback by what that means. The one aspect of it that is, I think, really important is trying to get a handle on. These things are anxiety-producing, I think. Biology is a classic example of this idea of sort of, people in garages all over the country messing with DNA.
And inventing and reinventing species.
Exactly. And the question is, what exactly do we do about that? How do we manage that
Does
process?
that scare you?
I was actually, to be honest, a little scared by that. But there was a recognition from the people that were talking about it that this was something that we need to think about. How do we manage it? How do we maintain security? Having said that, I do think from a numbers point of view, we're at a more stable place than we were, even with some of the crazy valuations for small companies, than we were in the late 90s.
Sharing economy, James, 19 billion for Uber, 11, 12, 13 billion for Airbnb. Madness or real?
Those valuations, while I don't know if they're accurate, they don't seem totally out of control to me, partly because the great virtue of those companies is they have such low costs that you can imagine if they're able to leverage them, it's all pure profit. It just drops to the bottom line. I have been more surprised by things like WhatsApp going for 19 billion.
What did you think when you saw that deal?
I was completely mystified by it.
I have to admit, when I saw that deal, and as you know, I'm slightly skeptical about a lot of this stuff. But when I saw that deal, I looked at it again and thought, that has to be 19 million.
Right. Because, how many employees? 20-something? It was some tiny number. But obviously one of the issues there is if you're Facebook, if you're Mark Zuckerberg, it may be worth it to you. You figure, what's another billion or so to just essentially preempt any competition.
Google and Facebook, are they still good bets for the future, do you think?
Yeah, at this moment, I think they are. I think one of the big ironies, and I talked about this a little bit, about this economy out here, is that while we hear all this talk about disruption and how it's so hard for incumbents, in fact, if you look at it, incumbents seem tremendously powerful, and I don't see any really profound threats on the horizon at the moment.
Or hopes, depending how you look at it.
Depending how you look at it. And obviously with Facebook, there's always that question of, are people just going to get tired of using it? But I think, both of those companies are at the moment creating a lot of value for consumers.
Do you think Facebook is sufficiently diversified that if everyone suddenly found Facebook to be troubling, creepy, unfashionable, that Facebook could still survive as a company?
Well, it could survive as a company, but obviously its valuation, would be totally.
And what about Google? Is Google still maintaining its momentum? Is it still continuing to reinvent itself and disrupt new markets?
Well, I think it is. The question, though, is obviously how much economic value are they creating? The one thing I really like about Google is actually its willingness to invest in products across a wide range. I think one of the big problems with the U.S. economy, this is a commonplace at this point, is that companies are actually hoarding cash rather than actually investing in it. And actually, even if you're a Google shareholder, if you're perhaps like, why are they bothering with self-driving cars or whatever it is, I think from the perspective of the broader economy, it's good that they're doing that. But the truth is, the core business is still very much, I think, advertising driven by the search engine.
Does the free economy work in your mind?
Free economy meaning Wikipedia?
Not Wikipedia, but the Google model of giving their product, their content out for free and selling advertising around it.
Well, I think in principle there's no reason to think it can't. It worked for television, it worked for radio, and I think the key obviously is, can you make the product valuable?
But from the point of view of the creative class, if there is a creative class left, at least in TV, the creators were paid for their work.
Yeah, that's a separate issue. If you want to talk about the free economy when it comes to, let's say, Spotify paying tiny royalties, there I have always been a little bit mystified about what the end game is, because obviously, ultimately, if creators are not incentivized to not just create, people are always going to want to make music or whatever, but to actually invest the time and energy to create real good music or real good works of journalism, there, I think, ultimately that's not going to work. If we
Big
don't
problem,
get paid
James.
anything.
Is this something that we should really be concerned of? As you know, I've written about it extensively. Some people believe that creators, that the internet is a dream for creators. I actually think it's in some ways more of a nightmare. Do you think that that this new digital economy can actually sustain a professional creative class?
It's hard for me to conclude one way or the other. I don't view it as a dream or a nightmare at the moment. It's certainly amazing to have your work be able to be disseminated as freely and to as many people as you are. But at the moment, we are still relying on old business models that are on their potentially on their last leg. So I think there are real reasons to be concerned. But let me just say one thing. The New Yorker is an interesting example. I mean, our subscription base has not dropped at all. We still have 1 million subscribers. And we obviously have many more readers because we're online. But advertising, that going forward, what is the actual status of that? I think that's a real issue.
James, you've written extensively on the impact of the digital economy on jobs generally. I know you've studied the work of Bryn Johnson and McAfee at MIT very seriously. This is a huge issue, isn't it?
Yeah, going forward, I think the question of the hollowing out of the middle class, the disappearance of good jobs, not just in manufacturing, but also potentially in services. I'm not a believer that strong AI is coming down the road anytime soon. So
no singularity on the horizon?
Not on the horizon. So I'm not as concerned about people, in knowledge workers getting vaporized by robots, not literally, but their jobs being vaporized by robots. But I do think that we have not really come to terms with what it's going to mean for of the vast majority of middle-class jobs to really come under serious threat.
So you don't agree with Peter Thiel's optimism that historically we have these cycles and there are always these Luddites around who worry that we're going to destroy jobs, but this new technology will always find ways of creating work?
I think it is possible. Maybe somewhere down the road they will end up creating jobs. And I certainly think you're going to see a lot more jobs in services. And I think computers are going to create jobs that are complementary to them. So that's the idea of the man-machine symbiosis being better than machines. I buy that. I think the real problem with the critique of Luddism is that it underrates how long and how painful those disruptions are.
And James, you're the economist. If I can't rely on you, who can I rely on?
Right.
I mean, are you, let's say 10, 15 years' time, are there going to be more or less jobs through all this technology?
Oh, I would say probably there are going to be fewer jobs.
Fewer jobs, and what are all these people going to do?
One of the things you hear a lot of is, they're going to become yoga teachers, or they're going to, become golf coaches or whatever. And I think there is something
Well,
to
that's
that.
Tyler Cowen's idea of this sort of, in his Averages Over, this kind of underclass of digital servants to the machines.
Yeah, so there's this question of, are we going to end up with a techno-aristocracy of a very small number of people, and that could include lawyers or whatever the people, and then there's a large number of people who are, in the service industry.
And that tiny elite has figured out how to talk to computers and manage them.
Yes.
We're not going to have singularity, but we'll have an elite of human beings who have figured out how to somehow encapsulate their humanity and make computers more valuable, more effective.
Yeah, and I mean, to be fair, I mean, there's some interesting studies that show, there's one study I just saw recently that showed that actually over the last 20 years, the jobs that have become most valuable are those that actually combine social skills and cognitive skills. So it isn't a pure just cognitive skill environment. I think part of it is, people who can be masters of organizational behavior and the like. There's still a big market for that, but I think for the middle class job, that's my biggest concern going forward.
So the nerds might not win.
I think the socially adept nerds, if they exist.
There's no such thing. By definition, a
nerd
has no social skills.
Yeah.
James, finally, you're very well known for your best-selling book, The Wisdom of the Crowd. The beginning of the book, you began with this sort of metaphor of a crowd guessing the weight of an ox,
yeah.
And they got it more accurately than experts. But the wisdom of the crowd doesn't always seem, especially on the internet, to be that self-evident. Are you still a proponent of the wisdom of the crowd? Do you still believe that the crowd is wiser than the expert?
I still believe that over time, betting on the crowd is better than betting on the expert.
Do I note some ambivalence there?
No, that's what I've always said. But what I would say is, I do think one of the problems. Let me say two things. One is that I think the one place where it has not been embraced to the degree it should is actually inside organizations. We really have the tools to allow companies to do a much better job of harvesting the knowledge of their employees, who at the very least, even if they're not experts, at least they're not random people. So I think companies should do a much better job of that. But the other thing I would say is my one concern, and I talk about this in the book, and it's become amplified, is that the internet makes it very easy for people to lose diverse thinking and not be independent, both of which they need to be for the crowd to be wise. And it's very easy to get locked into these echo chambers. And that, I think, is that's one of my biggest concerns about social media, is that it actually doesn't amplify the wisdom of the crowd. It actually makes it work less effectively.
Even more troubling than the echo chamber nature of the internet is perhaps the mob mentality.
Sure.
Does that worry you? I mean, the dark side of the wisdom of the crowd are the mobs on the web, the bullies, the attacks on women, the political radicalism that seems to prosper on the web. Does that bother you?
Yeah, and I think that to some degree I think of those things as connected, because I actually think that the echo chamber effect, or what they sometimes economists will call an information cascade, where because people are doing it, everybody else starts to think it's a good thing. I think those things can get amplified on the web. The way I tend to think about it is that the way you should use the web is to keep your links kind of as weak as possible. That's a concept from sociology, the value of weak links. Instead, I think what often happens is people have very tight-knit links, and as a result, it's very hard for them to see what they might be missing.
Well, James Surowiecki, a good dose of realism. When we need to be reminded that we can't live forever, we'll have James back on the show. Life doesn't go on forever, right, James?
Unfortunately not.
So we should enjoy ourselves while we can.
While we can.
And this was a very enjoyable interview. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Andrew.